Chapter 5, Cellular Respiration and Fermentation. Learning Outcomes 5.2a and B. 5.2a Explain lactate and alcohol fermentation. What is fermentation? It is a process that does not require oxygen in the breakdown of glucose. There are two types of fermentation. The first one is alcohol fermentation and the second one is lactate fermentation. Alcohol fermentation involves plant, bacteria, and yeast, while lactate fermentation occurs in animal. Explain lactate and alcohol fermentation. Both aerobic and fermentation involve glycolysis to oxidize glucose into pyruvate. NAD+ acts as electron acceptor and is reduced to NADH. The difference in both processes is the mechanism to oxidize NADH back to NAD+, which is required to sustain glycolysis process. Fermentation occurs when oxygen is not available. It involves only glycolysis pathway in cytoplasm. In the absence of oxygen, pyruvate cannot be transported into mitochondria to be oxidized further, so pyruvate will remain in cytoplasm. To avoid cells from ATP shortage, glycolysis must continue. As glycolysis continues, the concentration of NADH increases, while the concentration of NAD+ decreases. Cell has a limited supply of NAD+. In order to sustain glycolysis, NADH must transfer its electron to another organic compound. In the end, NADH is oxidized, thus NAD+ is regenerated. Organic compound which receive the electron is reduced. Reduced form of this organic compound are usually toxic to the cell, a waste byproduct. Types of fermentation depend on these organic compounds. Pyruvate will form lactate fermentation, while acetaldehyde will form alcohol fermentation. There are two types of fermentation. In lactate fermentation, pyruvate undergoes reduction and becomes lactate, while in alcohol fermentation, acetaldehyde is the compound that undergoes reduction and becomes ethanol. Lactate fermentation occurs in animal cells during strenuous activities. It occurs when oxygen is insufficient to support aerobic respiration. Glycolysis occurs to oxidize glucose into pyruvate. 2-NADH and 2-ATP is produced by substrate-level phosphorylation. Pyruvate will then receive electron from NADH, causing it to reduce to form lactate. NADH is oxidized to regenerate NAD+ to sustain glycolysis process. Lactate accumulates in muscle cell. Hydrogen ion concentration will increase. This will cause fatigue, muscle cramps, and soreness. Alcohol fermentation occurs in plant or bacterial cells. When oxygen is insufficient to support aerobic respiration, glycolysis occurs to oxidize glucose into pyruvate. 2-NADH and 2-ATP is produced by substrate-level phosphorylation. Pyruvate will then undergo decarboxylation, that is, removal of CO2. Pyruvate is then converted into acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde will receive electrons from NADH, causing it to reduce to form ethanol. NADH is oxidized to regenerate NAD plus to sustain glycolysis process. Compare aerobic and fermentation. In aerobic respiration, the process will produce 36 or 38 ATP. The product that is produced is carbon dioxide and H2O. In alcohol fermentation, which occurs in plant, bacteria, and yeast, only 2 ATP is produced, which is about 210 kJ. The product is carbon dioxide and ethanol. In lactate fermentation, which occurs in animal, only 2 ATP is produced and about 150 kJ of energy. The product that is produced is lactic acid. Importance of fermentation in industry. Fermentation is important in bakery, yogurt production, wine or beer or brewery, cheese, to produce vinegar, and also tempeh as local food. Fermentation is exploited by humans in industry such as food industry. Alcohol fermentation will produce products such as vinegar, beverages, alcohol production, and also used in bakery. Lactate fermentation will produce dairy products such as cheese and yogurt. Another example is yeast, which is used in brewing beer and wine. In bakery, yeast is added to the dough. Starch is then hydrolyzed by enzyme in yeast to maltose. Without the presence of oxygen, yeast will undergo alcohol fermentation. Carbon dioxide is released, and the dough will rise and soften in texture. Fermentation is also used in dairy products. Many anaerobic bacteria carry out lactate fermentation during growth on lactose in milk. Formation of lactate changes the pH of milk and the protein will then denature. This will cause milk to coagulate and curds are formed. These bacteria are manipulated in producing cheese, yogurt, buttermilk, sour cream, and sauerkraut. Lactase contributes sour taste to this product. In local food industry, fermentation is used to produce tempeh, which is fermented soybean, tosai, tapai, which is fermented tapioca or fermented rice, budu, which is fermented anchovy or fish sauce, chinchalo, which is fermented shrimp, and dade, which is fermented milk. In USA, we call it yogurt.